For those of you whom I have not met, my name is Ed Foley, and I have the privilege of holding the Duns Scotus Chair in Spirituality. As many of you know, the Scotus Chair was a gift from the Cincinnati province, the John the Baptist province of the Orders of Friars Minor. Their provincial, Father Mark, sends his regrets. We wanted to thank him in person, but he said that our own Professor John Barker, who is not only from that province, but also is on the provincial council. So if you want to thank somebody for this gift, thank John in the back. The Scotus Chair was given to CTU in 1997. It was first held by our beloved Bonaventurian scholar, Father Zach Hayes. And the second holder of that chair, and she always graces us with her presence, is distinguished Professor Diane Brigant. So thank you for being with us, Diane. We're very delighted that Professor Lin Hoang can be with us. He is a member of the Friars Minor from the Holy Name Province. He is currently Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Siena College. He's been teaching there since 2006. He's had quite an amazing experience of study and travel. He received a scholarship to study philosophy at Leuven, where he was studying philosophy and theology for a number of years. He eventually went to Fordham University, where he got a PhD in historical theology, writing on creating an Asian American theology. But most important maybe for us is that this is coming home for him, because he has the MDiv and the MA from Catholic Theological Union. He was here between 1994 and 1998. And at a very clever student, he completely avoided all of my classes. He wrote his MA with Professor Robert Schreider, we were speaking earlier on it. He also had, it was Zach Hayes also was on your board, and Professor Froelich, and I suggested that really this is what an oral exam is really all about. He, since going to Siena, he has been working with the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. He's been, as he says, ghostwriting a number of documents from them through the Office of Culture and Diversity, including Encountering Christ in Harmony and Vietnamese Catholics in the Church. He currently has a book offer from Routledge, and he is writing about Asian American Catholic experience and racism. And he notes that that's not a topic that many people deal with, that many people who write about Asian American or even Catholic Asian American experience do not address the issue of racism. So he's breaking fresh ground for us. We're delighted he's with us. Welcome home.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Ed. I wasn't actually trying to avoid your classes. I think it was, but it is an honor and a privilege to be back. And I was here when we were still having classes in the old hotel, and then the old apartment called the Heartbreak Hotel was still here. So if you want to know what the Heartbreak Hotel was all about, you can ask Ed. I think he lived in one of the apartments on this side that was knocked down. So to start, technology is. Okay, here we go. So Mira, a young 12-year-old girl playing on a beach with her brother, was seized by Portuguese slave traders in the year 1610. They were shackled and then taken to Cochin or Kochi in South India and then shipped to Manila, the Philippines, where under the guidance of missionaries, she converted to Catholicism. In 1619, disguised as a young boy, Mira was loaded on a ship of the Manila galleon and sailed across the Pacific Ocean to the port city of Acapulco, Mexico. There, she and many other galleon captives walked along the difficult and dangerous terrain, the Camino de China, or the China Road, from Acapulco to Mexico City, and then finally onto the city of Puebla. Before we get to that, I'm going to show you the map. So this is the road that she would have traveled, and if you're not familiar with Mexico, this will give you a sort of image of where I'm speaking about. There she became a servant to the devout Catholic couple, Miguel Sosa and his wife, Margarita Chavez. After Sosa's death and Chavez's entrance into a convent, she was granted relative freedom since she ended up serving in the local parish rectory of Padre Pedro Suarez. He eventually ordered her to marry another Asian slave, Domingo Suarez. They were married in 1627, but since she had consecrated herself to Christ, the marriage was never consummated. After both her husband and Padre Pedro died in 1640s, Mira continued living as a consecrated holy woman known to her followers as Catarina de San Juan. I have to apologize for my trying to get used to this. So, the name she adopted upon her conversion. She is revered as the Beata, who ministered to the poor and healed the sick. When Catarina died in 1688, many believers flocked to her home to pay tribute, turning it unofficially into a holy shrine. Pressured by popular demand, the Jesuits nominated her for official sainthood in the church. However, her candidacy for sainthood was rejected. During this period, it was the Mexican Inquisition, which was started under the direction of Bishop Juan de Zumarraga, who was a Franciscan and the first bishop of Mexico, which has already found a suspicion many of the Catholic practices observed by the indigenous population in the New World. Hence, church officials automatically assumed her visions were induced by witchcraft and accused her followers of superstitious practices. Devoted followers were not deterred and continued even more fervently to venerate her. Catarina became a folk hero, not only to the indigenous population, but to the emerging Creole, which are the Spanish descendants living in Mexico, in Puebla. In the 19th century, Catarina de San Juan was associated with the wholly popular and colorfully dressed La China Poblana. The claim is that the figure of the China began to emerge when the women of Puebla, loyal to Catarina, imitated her colonial fashion. The China Poblana is considered to symbolize Mexican womanhood while glorifying Mexico's mestiza, or mixed-race population. Ultimately, Catarina de San Juan, as La China Poblana, links the aspiration of Europe's search for Asia and the successful spiritual conquest of the New World. This lasted for about, under historical investigation, for about 2 centuries, and it found it was incorrect. There are actually 2 different women. One is the La China Poblana, and the other is the Catarina de San Juan. To this day, we're not sure who is the other woman. But nevertheless, the manipulation of Mira identity from an Asian slave to Catarina as the saintly figure, and then considered to be the China Poblana, who at that time was a derogatory term, demonstrates through the malleability of identities through the complexities of migration. So this presentation begins with the story of Catarina de San Juan as a springboard to understand how slavery, manipulated by Spanish explorers, shaped the way enslaved people from Asia, collectively called Chinos, became the acceptable Indios, or the indigenous of the Americas. The enslaved Chinos used the Spanish legal system to their advantage by identifying themselves as Indios, especially since indigenous people gained exemption from enslavement. A more positive attitude towards the indigenous population was instilled into colonial Mexico through the efforts of Bishop Juan de Zumarraga, known also as the protector of the Indians. He and the other Franciscan missionaries were able to provide a more peaceful encounter with the native population, countering the conquering attitude of Spanish colonials. Asian slavery, the Franciscan missionaries, and colonial Mexico intersect at a period in church history to provide new perspectives on Asian American identity, as well as the foundation of Catholicism in the Americas. In reflecting on these elements, I approach it from a theology of place. From early Christian thinking, place is not just a temporary or provisional concept, but also is an enduring aspect for community building and rebuilding. Place, as demonstrated in the story of Genesis, takes shape as people settled and then reclaimed their rightful place either through establishing sacred structures or marking the land with their distinct identity. The sacred place that the transported slaves, conquistadors, and immigrants create to play is the place of the Americas. And we start of how they got here. We start with the Manila galleon. The Manila galleon began in 1565 to transport Asian individuals and products to the New World and other Asian ports. This continued for approximately 250 years. Estimates vary over the actual numbers of Asian slaves transported. At best, it's about 1.5 million, with another 2 million people lost at sea. They would be shipped to ports across Asia and to the New World. There were approximately 50,000 Asian slaves shipped across the ocean to Acapulco alone. These galleons started to grow in number as the Spanish Empire expanded and developed. Approximately 15 galleons departed from Manila each year. The galleons consisted usually of up to 20 ships packed full of products, workers, and slaves. Interestingly, the galleons would also sell tickets to adventure seekers and those desiring to resettle the New World. We might assume that this was the beginning of the cruise ship industry as they were selling tickets. So these are some of the pictures of the galleon and the port where they would have landed. Sorry about that. So why did the Manila become such an important entrepot to the movement of slaves? Peonage, or debt servitude, existed in the Philippines long before the Spanish arrived. Its enduring history and the economic importance maintained the society's survival. The Spaniards actively manipulated this debt peonage into a thriving slave market for their own economic ends. The Spanish crown entered into a series of contracts with merchants and later with the entire trading companies. They identified the slave trade as a source of revenue and thus awarded greater concessions to those who could deliver a steady supply of slave labor. The Portuguese explorers also contributed to the growing slave population in the Philippines. The vessels from colonies and trading ports in Africa, India, the Malay Peninsula, Japan, and China brought slaves to Manila. The explorers relied heavily on people captured in places such as Timor, Burma, Ceylon, and India, since they fetched the highest prices. Because, quoting, "the men are industrious and obliging, and many are good musicians. The women are excellent seamstresses, cooks, and they are neat and clean in their service," unquote. Their assumption of the accommodating attitude of the indigenous population made it easy to force them into servitude. Being part of this galleon makes Catarina de San Juan's story even more intriguing. After Catarina's death, her priest confessors, Alonso Ramos and Jesus de Castillo, both Jesuits, wrote hagiographies detailed but also reconstructed her life through her own perspective. They did this, however, to clarify that she was from Asia, and Ramos underscored the fact that all Asians are called Chinos. In these parts, natives of India are called Chinos, but all come from the Orient by the way of the Philippines, brought by the Portuguese, quoting from Ramos. The term Chinos refers generally to all Asians who traveled on the Manilan galleon. Ramos makes, however, an important distinction about the status of Chinos. So there were Chinos who were slaves, but also there were Chinos, generally natives of the Philippines, who were free immigrants, itinerant traders, or sailors. The word Chino China became synonymous, however, with all Asians, no matter their social status, free or enslaved. All Chino traveled to Mexico on the Manila galleon. The slaves, like Catarina, generally stayed with their masters until, if fortunate enough, they were freed. Also, since many of the Chinos were men, women who were rarely brought on as slaves were protected, or in the case of Catarina, disguised as a young boy in order to escape harassment and avoid abuse. Galleon rule was that there would be no women on the ship. But there's some historical evidence that actually some of the nuns were taken. If you understand sort of the history of the nuns, they were actually coming from the Atlantic, and then would walk across from Pueblo to Acapulco, and then shipped from the Manila galleon to the Philippines. So the nuns were actually some of the other women who actually would be on these trips. And then furthermore, the word Chino had attracted many different meanings by the time Catarina came to Puebla. It meant servant, mestizo of the lower classes, a Quechua word which simply meant female or a physically small woman, among other things. But also Chino took on a racial identification by skin color. Some Chinos will label as blanco, white, moreno, brown, prieto, which is dark, and the color amanborrido, which I can't pronounce so well, which is taken from the fruit, the quince, sort of a yellowish color. So the various meaning and identification attached to Chino made it difficult to distinguish exactly the Asian presence in Mexico, especially since now Chino meant so many different things. But as more Chino arrived in Mexico and the other New World countries, the concern has been about their status as slave or free. And this becomes the debate that occupied the Spanish through the debate on the enslavement of indigenous people. So how did the Spanish see slavery? In the medieval period, Spanish authorities asserted that any hostile enemy can be enslaved if they refuse to convert to Christianity. An enemy, then, is identified as anyone who is against the Catholic Church and the Crown. Pope Nicholas V, in 1452, issued the bull Dum Diversas, legitimizing slavery, at least as a result of war. It granted the right to reduce any Saracens, pagans, and any other non-believers to secular hereditary slavery, especially since they would refuse conversion. In the 15th century, King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile appointed a committee of lawyers and theologians to help them come to a determination on the whole institution of slavery. This body deliberated for an astonishing 5 long years without coming to a definitive conclusion. They accepted the practice already in place, that the enslavement of those considered uncivilized, war captives, or unwilling to convert could still be enslaved. Nevertheless, the contents of the debate are not known because somehow the committee's report mysteriously disappeared and is now lost. But the Queen, according to chroniclers on her deathbed, mandated that the indigenous people were not to be enslaved while still leaving room for an ambivalent attitude towards secular slavery. So one of the practices of the Spanish crown was demanded by all colonies landed on new territories to read the requiremento, or the requirement of 1513. It served as a polite gesture to inform the indigenous population of the crown's intention and forceful assertion of authority, but also proclaimed the divine right of the Spanish to take possession of the territories of the New World and to subjugate, or if necessary, to fight native inhabitants for control. This seemed to promise the enslavement of the indigenous population. As the Spanish conquerors were settling in the New World, legal battle raged in their royal courts back home, taken up by theologians, lawyers, and church officials, wrestling with the moral and legal rights of indigenous enslavement. In 1530, Charles V decreed that for the first time that the indigenous people of the newly colonized land were his vassals, and underscored that they could not be enslaved, even if they were taking in just wars. Charles V extended this precedence of protection to indigenous people who met 3 criteria: that they surrendered peacefully to Spanish soldiers, they accepted Christian missionaries, and they paid tribute to the king. The king gained further support when Pope Paul III penned his exhortation Sublimus Deus, the Sublime God, in 1537, which forbade the enslavement of indigenous people of the Americas. It seemed that the case against the enslavement of the indigenous population was resolved. However, Spanish colonists resisted the king and the Pope's effort to categorize all native people as vassals. So at the local level, colonists ignored or outright opposed the monarch's prohibition on indigenous slavery. For instance, in the northern territories of Mexico, colonists continued to carry out slave raids among native people, generally under the guise that they were fighting just wars against hostile enemies. The Crown tried to mitigate the efforts of raiding, but was unsuccessful. So royal decrees against indigenous slavery never disputed the legitimacy of the whole institution of secular slavery. It just distinguished who could and could not be enslaved, leaving room for the colonists to interpret and implement what they thought fit for their own situation. So the debate on the indigenous slavery never died, but it continued to simmer until it reached a boiling point in the royal courts of Valladolid in 1550. King Charles V ordered a group consisting of jurists and theologians to hear the arguments. On one side was the Dominican friar, Bartolomeu de las Casas, who had sailed with Christopher Columbus to the New World in 1498. He became a fierce defender of the Indian rights. And on the other side was Juan Gines de Sepúlveda, a Greek scholar who justified conquest and evangelization with just war protocols. Their dispute initially focused on the right of conquest and just war, but festering beneath this was the concern over the enslavement of indigenous population. Since this debate was so crucial to the continued exploration of the New World, the Crown temporarily halted all exploration to the New World itself until the debate was settled. At the heart of this debate was the question of how to interpret the Bible, Aristotle, and Spanish law. De Sepúlveda argued that Indians were barbarians, infidels, and committed crimes against natural law. Using Aristotle's philosophy, he argued that the barbarians were natural slaves because they were ruled by their passions only, whereas civilized people were ruled by their reason. Therefore, it's more of a ruling Spanish crown to take Indian lands and to enslave them for their own benefit. They would be better people if they were under enslavement. Las Casas denied that Aristotle's concept of natural slaves applied to Indians because they, the Indians, do possess reasons or are receptive to conversion, and quoting from Las Casas, being capable of clear, deliberate, and acute understanding, they are docile and open to good doctrine and apt recipients of the Catholic faith, unquote. He argued that these were already criteria set out early in the Spanish Empire. So even though the group did not declare a clear winner from the Valladolid debate, the Crown seemed to settle in favor of Las Casas. He argued that Indians were fully human vassals, making them special wards of the Crown. This provided the confirmation needed by the Crown to continue the practice of not enslaving the indigenous population and continue their conquest of the New World. So how did the Chinos fare in this whole debate? The Spanish Crown did not particularly single out Chinos in their debate about the enslavement of the indigenous population. Since the conclusion was not to force enslavement of the Indios, the Chinos started to use this to their advantage. They self-identified as Indios. So throughout the Spanish Empire, indigenous people were generally called Indios in reference to their geographic origins in the eastern and western Indies. More importantly, Indios denoted that they were people who had been conquered, forced to accept Spanish sovereignty over their lands and to make tribute. In return, Indians had a distinct legal and fiscal status to the vassals of the Spanish king. Furthermore, Spanish authorities instituted a complex governing structure for their empire. They divided the population into two distinct republics, or political communities. In Mexico, the indigenous majority belonged to the Republic of Indians, which consisted of Spaniards, free people of the mixed descent, and all slaves belonged to the Republic of Spaniards, or the Republic of Españolas. So under this schema, free natives of the Philippines belonged to the Republic of Indians, where they lived in their own borders, in their own town of birth, in their borders, or elsewhere in the empire. The structure of the republic was meant to promote political stability and facilitate Spanish dominion. The system, which involves residential segregation, separate local governments, and distinct courts, provided legal structure and certain rights to all native people, including protection from enslavement. So free Chinos of the Philippines who came to Mexico emphasized that they were members of the Republic of the Indians to differentiate themselves from Chino slaves, who as slaves legally belonged to the Republic of the Spaniards. They confirmed their corporate membership by paying tribute and sought legal protection to the General Indian Court. So according to this policy then, residential segregation, Indians were supposed to live in indigenous neighborhoods or villages headed by indigenous leaders. The Crown purported or objected to this isolation of Indians from the colonists. So as part of this effort, the colonial government banned non-Indians from living among the native population, so really clear separation from the two. From the Crown's perspective, political order required that indigenous vassals live in structured civil communities. The stress on this separation proved critical because it explained in part how the Crown eventually accepted that Chinos could not be slaves because they blend seamlessly into the Republic of Indians. Under this logic, the only people who remained in the Republic of Spaniards are legal slaves who were at this time mostly of African descent. So Chino slaves also used the apparatus of the legal system to assert that their identity as Indios in order to move about the whole empire. They did this by mainly through Indios testifying on their behalf and their own personal testimony. Many colonial administrators found it difficult to conceptualize indigenous vassals to people born in Asia. And then confused Spanish officials often questioned these Chinos' legal standing and challenged their claims to being Indios. But Indios corroborated the Chinos' claim. It became hard to dispute since even Chinos resembled the free Indios, which from a master's perspective made branding them as necessary means to ensure that they would not pass for free people. So some masters cruelly through branding, branded their Chino slaves on the face, making their slave status even more visible and permanent. The practice of branding the face had already been done through the early Spanish conquest. It was not customary, however, to brand black slaves who were already marked in their darker skin. The Franciscans were among the first to decry the practice of branding itself. They accused the colonists of acting against divine law and encouraged the slaves to perpetual bondage. It was particularly horrific to mutilate Indians in this way because so many of them were unjustly enslaved. The emperor agreed, describing the practice as a disservice to God. As such, the Crown mandated that free Indians could never be marked in this way, which was solely reserved for slaves. Face branding, however, was allowed to continue as punishment for Indian warriors who fought against the Spaniards. Then after 1672, there was no market for the selling of Chinos as slaves, for the simple reason that no longer they were legally held as slaves in Spanish America. Even though this market declined in the trans-Pacific slave trading companies from the Atlantic side, centered in Africa, began to increase. So the shift towards accelerating African enslavement underscores the fact that acceptance of slavery only shifted rather than ended itself. The third part, the Franciscans. Oops. Just as the Franciscans opposed the treatment of slaves in Mexico, they were also involved in Catarina's life. According to her biographers, Catarina's earliest confessors in Puebla were Franciscans. After the death of her husband and priestmaster, the Jesuits became her confessors, though. There were no details as to why this occurred or the reason she chose a Jesuit. A speculation may be that after King Philip V appointed a new bishop in Puebla, Juan de Palafox y Mendoza, who was a diocesan priest in 1639, the diocesan policies changed. The bishop introduced new laws, a patent to ban the religious order, especially corporate membership by especially the mendicants from religious indoctrination of Indians, if they did not submit to an examination on theology and Indian languages. Bishop Halifax further obligated regular clerics to invest in the royal treasury instead of the local land. His mandate especially affected the Doctrina de Indios, or the Indian parishes, that he thought were very lucrative and which happened to be overwhelmingly under the protection of the Franciscans. He consequently expelled unqualified mendicants. What he deemed unqualified was their supposed lack of the Indian language, the lenient approach to baptism, and the rather harsh denunciation of the native religious tradition. So by 1645, Franciscans left all the parishes of the diocese to the satisfaction of the bishop. We believe that this is Bishop Halifax, who was the bishop during that period. So the struggle in Puebla provides an understanding of the Franciscan missionary presence in the New World. When the Franciscans first arrived in 1524, Hernan Cortes, the conqueror of Mexico, welcomed 12 Franciscan apostles to Mexico by making them the first Catholic missionaries. They created centers to evangelize Indians in rural and urban areas called doctrinas. The stabilizing practice set in motion an evangelical program of conversion. They worked with numerous native groups such as the Nuas, Otomis, and Mayas. Their intense missionary activity is evident in the many indigenous languages the Franciscans learned, the grammars and vocabularies they wrote, the numerous biblical texts they translated, and the catechism they published. The Franciscans began to enjoy special papal and royal prerogatives over the administration of the doctrinas that included sacramental as well as economic benefit, which was not the case for all orders at that time. This paved the way for more friars to arrive and to create new doctrinas throughout Mexico and the New World. So this is considered to be the meeting of the 12 apostles with Hernan Cortes. So the Franciscans viewed the Spanish purpose in the New World as more spiritual, that is, gaining the souls of the Indians for Christ. Geronimo de Mendieta, a missionary from among the Indians, and his Historia Ecclesiasta Indiana, described the Franciscan mission and Spanish conquest in terms of an apocalyptic, messianic, and prophetic mysticism stemming from the life of St. Francis himself. So the discovery of the New World marked the beginning of the end of the world. Spain, he believed, was destined to provide the promised one, the Messiah, world ruler, who would bring all humankind under Christ's yoke. The process was not necessary to be peaceful. The false tribes must be destroyed and the heathen converted before the New Jerusalem could be established. Then the emperor might rule over the millennial kingdom, which would end at the last judgment. For him, Hernan Cortes was another Moses sent to rescue a suffering people. So the coercion of Cortes applied to the bodies of the Indians tends to be justified by the Franciscans as an aid to their spiritual elevation. In addition, by helping bring the non-believers to Christianity, prepare the whole Christian world for the last age of this world. Fray Martin de Valencia, the leader of the 12 Apostles of Mexico, was explicitly inspired also by apocalyptic ideals. These apocalyptic expectations, which a small number of Franciscans shared, had been a distinctive feature of a particular strand of Franciscan thought and spirituality, founded its inspiration in the exegetical works of the 12th century monk Joachim of Fiore. There we go. This is supposed to be Joachim. And we have why his exegetical theology is important here. So his idea was that there were three ages: age of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Which the age of the Father is the Old Testament, the age of the Son is the New Testament, and the age of the Holy Spirit is the order of the just. and the order of the just is the Franciscan, he considered. And so this third period of war and peace that would make the ecclesiastical hierarchy unnecessary, but is done by the sword rather than the peaceful means, and whose inheritance becomes known as the spirituals. So on Mexican soil, the early Franciscans settled into the land. The apocalyptic expectation began to duly be modified. They witnessed the impact of Spanish colonization practices that was based on greed and the European diseases that decimated the Indian population, which made them reevaluate their interpretation of the more spiritual mission of Spain. Mendieta's apocalyptic optimism turned into an apocalyptic pessimism. So the glorious vision of the millennial kingdom, unifying humankind, was not to be. This is supported by his brother, Fray Bernardino de Sahagan, who from the beginning was not apocalyptic-minded, but has stated that the missionary activities of the friar was another step in the church mission to go out and evangelize, but accepting the limits of what they can do. He based this on the fact that the Indian population was not readily taking to Christianity and that they were disappearing under the impact of the conquest itself. Another important person in this episode is again we visit Juan de Zumarraga, who was the first bishop of Mexico and happened to be observant Franciscan. Bishop Zumarraga was also influenced by the wave of apocalyptic sentiment informed by the participation in the Spanish Inquisition. His request for the Inquisition powers in the New World was the desire first to protect and preserve the considerable Franciscan investment in the New World itself. His Inquisition was marred by violence, even though he had wanted only to use persuasion to get to the truth. The result of the Inquisition, as commented by Patricia Lopez Don, was that the supple and versatile universe of native belief system allowed its native leaders to shape the contours of the Franciscan teaching into their own benefit, unquote. So Zumarraga was also considered protector of the Indians. He had stated that he did not know of any divine law or natural or civil ecclesiastical ones that natives were justly reduced to slavery. He supported their emperor's stance against the enslavement of the indigenous population. In his 18 years in Mexico, he advanced the education of the indigenous population by creating schools as well as a college, and advocated for the translation of the Bible into native language, to help create a hospital to care for the disease that the conquerors were bringing. So the missionary activities of the Franciscans endured and continued to thrive, but also critiqued by the missionary friars themselves. From their engagement with the secular authority, institutional hierarchy, and the on-the-ground experience with the indigenous population, the Franciscans argued that a simple, poor, and evangelical church with a reduced role for the episcopate, which is the best way to have church. So this, in their opinion, would be what should have happened, and we could say it could be happening today, or should happen today. So the friars were very much determined to establish their disengagement from the ambitious conquistadors, since they witnessed what they had done to the indigenous population. The friars' ambivalence, but also cooperation with the Spanish crown, places them, however, squarely as participants in the conquest of the New World, with both its good and bad outcomes. So then finally, in conclusion, right. Here we go. In the Christian world, the role of place has been overshadowed frequently by the overwhelming sense of time. We see this here in the apocalyptic urgency of evangelization, which destroy the place of the New World. A theology of place takes seriously the lived experience of all faithful people who incorporated their religious experience to the places in which they encounter and then dwell. Place is then both concrete but also potential, since it is being shaped and reshaped by those dwelling in place. This becomes an experience of others and the environment where one dwells. To that end, place can be considered as a constituent part of God's creation that God is already renewing and will finally renew at the end of the ages. The ability to experience the presence of God in place challenges but also moves believers, beyond the self to the broader environment and to engage others who are also dwelling in place. So a theology of place is a collective pursuit that relies on people in their right communities, reflecting on their part in God's creation. For the Franciscans, it was an encounter and then living with the indigenous population that changed their mind about their approach to conversion. Their cooperation with the Spanish conquistadors make it difficult to fully detach them from being part of the slaving and racial discrimination of the indigenous population, as well as the Chino slaves. Certainly, the Franciscans left an indelible mark in the place of Mexico, a mark still alive in popular traditions, monumental constructions, popular devotion, and folk art, but also in the spirit of the people. But also their endeavor shows how Christianity still has much to reconcile and plead for forgiveness. Place is entitled to all care. That is, all must take responsibility for the created world, because God's glory and our well-being are at stake in our placemaking. We must take responsibility of the place and for creation within our places where we dwell. The story of Catarina de San Juan, the slave-turned-Christian in colonial Mexico, was very much a product of the history of human slavery, but also of placemaking. Her life story extends to places that do not border just on the Atlantic, but stretches across various lands and places. Her vision, which connected Asia and the Americas together, provided insight on how missionaries saw Asia and the Americas as fertile ground for missionary work. Catarina became a heroine for the Creole class and also promoted as mestiza. But the reality is that as China, she molded a new place to her benefit and for the benefit of others around her. The Manila galleon displaced Catarina de San Juan as well as other Asians. They were then resettled in the Americas, making them one of the first settlers as well as the first Catholics in the New World, and eventually as a new group of indigenous people, the New World itself. So the quest to understand Asian American identity is now complicated by this search, well, or at least for me by this search, into the earliest presence of Asians in the Americas. The complexities of racial, religious, missionary, and colonial stories reveal that the standard narrative of Asian America has been too narrow, that it has been focused mainly on the United States, and designed to justify the Western histories of colonialism, neocolonialism, identity, and forced labor. Asian American studies has been fixated by the quest to justify the Asian presence in the United States in order to claim an active voice in America. What the stories of the Chino in Mexico provide is that the hyphenated or the binary identity Asian American has already laid claim to that identity, but also it reveals a much longer and complicated history of Asians as already part of the earliest period of Spanish conquest. A serious discussion on Asian American is to consider this transport of Chino slaves across the Pacific, where they were unwittingly part of the conquest. From this, many Asians were being baptized into a Catholicism that felt the urgency to save the whole world, a Catholicism that on the one hand struggled against the inhumane treatment of native people, but also accepted it as being part of the salvation history. But it is this same Catholicism that supported Catarina as a saintly woman to guide disenfranchised people to a rightful place as part of God's creation. Thank you.